Hi, I'm Frank Coleman, and I'm the Bureau Chief for the Secret Agent Project. And this is another in a series of behind the music, behind the scenes videos about how I made the debut album of Secret Agent entitled Declassified. This is the fifth song on the album. It's Washington, D.C. Now, this was actually chronologically the second song that I wrote for Secret Agent. Buenos Aires International Airport was the first. Um, and so Buenos Aires is a very, very intense project. And, I didn't know if I was ever going to do a second one, so I kind of threw everything, including the kitchen sink, into that. The other thing is in going back and revisiting my source files for these songs now, the older they are, the more, horrific and more I sort of go, oh my God. And this being very early in the process, this one looks really amateurish to me in terms of like how I think about and how I do layout for my projects in Logic, which is this program that we use for arranging and recording and mixing music. So anyway, let's just kind of dive in here. Let me move a few things around so we can see what we're looking at here. And this is the mixer. Each one of these faders is the volume level for an individual track. Or what is called a bus, a sub mix. So like all the drums come together on this one, all the bass sounds come together on this, all the keyboard sounds come together here, guitar, sax. These are all delays and reverbs and stuff, and way down here is the vocals, which are the samples and stuff, and they all finally get mixed together into one big final output, and out it goes to the master. So these are the individual tracks. This is Logic from Apple. And as I say here, this was well, it's sort of organized. There's not there's not an awful lot of tracks here going on compared to something like New York, which has got tons of tracks. New York was one of the last songs that I did, and that's a lot better organized than we have here. One of the things that I eventually learned was to not give your tracks big long names, because by the time you get over here to your mixer, they all kind of get truncated with ellipses, and you're like, what the hell was that? So this whole project was also like my voyage, and my voyage of learning through and refinement of my own recording process using Logic, but just getting better and more organized and all like that. So anyway, whatever. So let's dive into the song. It is pretty straight ahead. There aren't an awful lot of parts here. Actually, there's a drum set part. There's a bass line. There's my friend John Schmay on the organ, he actually played that live. He did a whole improv a couple times through, and then I snipped out little bits and pieces that I liked and arranged them. Let's see, there's a couple clavinet parts. Those are actually Apple loops. Actually, a lot of the song is Apple loops. We'll dig into that a little bit more detail later. And then there's guitar sounds. Part of the guitar sound is from the Apple library, and part of the guitar sounds are from my friend Robert Holmes. And we'll talk more about that later. And then there's sax parts, and those are from my dear friend and colleague Duncan Kilburn, formerly of the Psychedelic Furs. And then there are a bunch of vocal samples, and they are from a kaleidoscope of different movies and stuff, and they're all little teeny little bits, mostly saying "get up," or "sit down." So this is my Shaggy Dog Story track. The whole silly idea here is to use like police procedural and film noir and detective and crime story movie directives of a police officer saying "get up," and as opposed to, or it's as a reference to James Brown, like saying "get up," exhortations to a forgery suspect substituting for exhortations to the audience. Okay, I think I've beaten that joke to death sufficiently now. And so that was, sort of the takeoff for this. Yeah, I went around and around with this song for the longest time, and you know what the last piece to get finished about this song was the name. For the longest time, I didn't know what the hell to call this. I was called this Amsterdam, Los Angeles. I had no idea. And because it was all based around this get up theme. And it wasn't until, just towards the end, just kind of racking my brain and looking at what I had and what was missing. And what was missing, obviously, was the nation's capital and the hub of bureaucracy in the world. And so it's just like suddenly everything made sense. Anyway, let's just kind of jump into this. Now, the other thing is that since this is so old, this project didn't start in Logic. It started in a software program called Soundtrack Pro, which was part of the early Final Cut Pro suite of products. So what I had to do at a certain point was export each one of the tracks from Soundtrack Pro as individual standalone files, and then brought them into Logic so that I could continue on, because Soundtrack Pro doesn't work anymore. It's been killed, dead by Apple. It sort of runs on my aging Mac Tower, but so I had to do a sort of a Berlin airlift. I can't tell you how many times I've had to do this sort of thing where I have to like airlift out my data out of one version or one technology, move it into another. And that's what you have to do, and that's part of the reason why I'm doing this in such detail now, is because I'm capturing this time and this time period and the tools I had to use in order to do this stuff. And as I say, this whole project was an evolution through those tools and through that tool set, so much so that what I started out with, I can't even show you now, even when I'm doing this project, to do a retrospective. But so all of this is to say that preservation is incredibly important. It's something I've had to be in my bonnet about like forever. And I've seen it happen so many times, making stuff in one particular flavor of technology, and it's absolutely worthless and unplayable and inaccessible in the next generation. Anyway, welcome to Washington, D.C. And so this is all sort of by way of saying that the source files that I used for these parts in Soundtrack Pro were tethered to the respective loops in the Apple Loops library. Here's Apple's loops, and you can pick drum sets and stuff like that. And here's 100 million, zillion beats. Of course, I, being a drummer, like to make my own. But in this case, I wanted to comp a new idea, having just done Buenos Aires International Airport, and that is such a sprawling, epic thing. And it's just this orgy of Latin percussion, this orgy of syncopation through the whole thing, that I wanted the second song to be very, very not cut and dried or simple, but I wanted it to be really kind of down to earth and rooted. And not as complex musically, but not for its own sake, in the purpose of being something that is just like this undeniable groove. A funk tune. I definitely wanted it to be funk. I wanted it to be stylistically really, a contrast to Buenos Aires. B-side, right? So I guess this was conceived to be like, if I were going to have a B-side for that, what would it be? Well, it would be this. So the drum set beat is from an Apple loop. There's two of them, basically. And the bass lines are as well. Those are loops. The organs were played live by Schmey. The clavinet parts are, and the clavinet solo is loops from the library, and they were a lot more sliced up than they are here. The guitar, the rhythm guitar, is from the Apple Loops library. The solo stuff is Robert Holmes, but it's from his solo that he cut for Buenos Aires that I took and I sliced up and I repurposed here. Happens to be in the same key. Then there's a guitar solo in the main break part. That's sort of like the main melodic theme, and that's Robert. And then at the end, there's this sort of spiky solo that's sort of my little nod to the Gang of Four, and that's bits and pieces of guitar noise of him cut up into shards. And then we have Duncan with all of his sax parts, and Duncan just basically did a few takes through the thing. I took it and I cut it up and rearranged it, to my liking. And that's, at this point, that was like the process that I was in. Well, I mean, that is the sort of the process I've been with everybody. The only person I think I've done unbroken takes for is me. everybody else, I mean, I guess it's sort of the nature of the beast. It was also sort of the modus operandi about how I was going about this stuff. You know, I ask a great sax player for sax parts, then I have a palette of sax colors here. I'm still the artist. You know, he's giving me this garden of stuff to pick from. Same with Robert with his beautiful guitar playing. You know, and I pick from and I put them into my painting as I see fit. But I'm still the guy with the brush, putting them in. That's how I approach this, you know, this aspect of working with other people. Because this is my project, and I really wanted and needed to like just kind of not turn it into a band thing. I wanted it to be like, you know, an auteur theory project. Anyway, let's play this thing. Let's take a listen.
Well, don't expect any official help.
I never do, sir.
Okay, so those are like the main ingredients of the first riff. Those samples there, that's Dana Andrews and Brett Halsey from a movie called Spy in Your Eye that's never released in this country. It's certainly never released on home video. I have an Italian print of it somewhere. And it's just loaded with great dialogue. Those two guys show up again in Portofino. And Dana Andrews is just one of my all-time favorites and a great secret agent archetype, Mr. Sourpuss. Anyway, so we've got the two of them, and we got this drum beat, which is from an Apple loop, and the bass line is from an Apple loop, and these two guitar parts are Apple loops. Yeah, we've got this one guitar part here. I mean, that is just how funky could you possibly be? And then we got this other one over here. Yeah, you notice I named it T-Heads because it reminds me a little bit of the riff in Psycho Killer. Put the two of them together, and you get... And add the bass. This bass is just such a great funky line here. Right? And that's the bass part all through this whole thing until we get to the chorus. I mean, what a great line that is. That thing is like the cyclone at Coney Island. It just goes up and down, and it only hits when it finally hits dunk on the bottom is where it finally hits the root that you need to give you the root for the chord for what everybody else is doing. The rest is just like, whoa, lady. It's awesome. You know, and that fret buzz is part of the loop, obviously. You don't hear it. It just becomes part of the overall mix with everything. If anything, just like there's this faint atmosphere of breathing. Anyway, put them all together and it spells funk. Okay, first verse. So yeah, somewhere in there is Nat Pendleton, who's another favorite of ours. He's always kind of like, okay, boss, you're the brains of the operation. One of those guys, you know, in the Superman movies. Yeah, Washington Wants Results. That's from some Eurospy thing. I'm sorry, I forget. I could look it up, but. The names of the geographical locations appear once, if at all, in these songs, kind of like Al Hirschfeld's Nina of his drawings, or Alfred Hitchcock's cameo that happens. Let's go with that one. It's the geographical locations being mentioned here are a little like Alfred Hitchcock's cameo in relation to the overall rest of the song. Anyway.
So you pull yourself together, you go on to the next job, the next saxophone player.
Keep monitoring the embassy.
Okay. So yeah, the next saxophone player, and here he is. It's the next saxophone player is obviously Duncan Kilburn from the Psychedelic Furs, who is just great. And he and I are already talking about Volume 2 of Secret Agent. So yeah, and in comes John Schmay with that great mysterious organ sound. And let's see, off we go. Now, I have to say something here because, I love these guitar parts even though they're Apple loops, and I made a mistake in doing this song, and I actually felt bad about it. I asked Robert to cut some parts for this, but I already had like this much sketched out, and the problem was this isn't entirely my fault. By the time I got his parts back, I'd gotten so used to listening to these guitar parts that they had become canonical in my mind. I couldn't separate them from the song. They'd become integral to the identity of the song, and it didn't matter what Robert played. He's brilliant. Robert's one of the greatest guitar players on the face of the earth, as is amply demonstrated in Buenos Aires. But so I wasn't able to use him, and I think he felt bad, and I felt bad about that. So I'm going to use those parts for something somewhere else, like nothing wasted. We'll find some way to recycle them. But anyway, I just wanted to make note of that. Sorry.
You have information. Everybody has information but me.
Yeah, that's that's Peter Angeli. A lot of this stuff is from Spy in Your Eye. I think that naturally I had to pretend to accept their offer. I think that may have been as well. And I'm trying to play a little bit, screw out a little bit with, obviously with, hip hop conventions and stuff like that, and all, just because I'm a wise ass. Anyway, now that right there, that's Robert. That's Robert Holmes. That whole call and response thing, that's what I mean about, editing. Each one of those licks, were elsewhere, and in Robert's case, it's a completely different song. And in Duncan's case, it's just part of a couple of larger takes. It's just that as I was listening to it, I listened, I go, there's a phrase, there's a word, there's a sentence, there's a bit, here and there. And I just kind of like radar, I just like kind of zero in on these little figures, like that's an interesting melodic piece, and then that's my job as curator, artist, slicer and dicer, whatever, arranger, to make those decisions about what to put in, and then get it just right, and season just right. Anyway, yeah.
Sit down. Get up. Get up. Get up. That's enough. Right. Get up. Get up. Sit down. Stand up. Put your hands up. Get up. Get up. I think it's possible the girl does know.
Yeah. Yeah, this is some of my favorite stuff. Oh dear. And the extent to which we have to go to get material sometimes, that stand up, put your hands up, I mean, how perfect is that? That's like right out of James Brown, except that's the sheriff in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid telling Paul Newman and Robert Redford to get up because they're going to blast him. Oh my. I mean, there's bits and pieces here and there and hither and yon that aren't at all from spy movies. They're from someplace else. And it might be just a tiny, tiny little fragment, but it's just what I needed. I would have this to say about that. At the the Home Office can neither confirm nor deny that in the course of, in-depth, long-term investigations like this, evidence can come from lots of different places and in lots of different forms, and sometimes is hiding in plain sight and is sometimes obfuscated and is, and that's the intelligence officer's job, is to sort through all that stuff and try to make sense, or at least music out of it.
And where do you think you're going? There are ways to get you to talk, unpleasant though they may be. Plane is ready. You'll have to jump this time.
Okay, now here's where we get into the solo thing. So this is a clavinet solo. I love clavinets. I never get enough clavinet. I mean, it's so 70s. It's so 70s cop show thing. In fact, I think some of the samples in the Apple Loops library are like 70s cop show clavinet, But this, I just took the most wackadoodle clavinet parts that I could find out of the library, and I just cut them up into a bunch of different pieces and rearranged them to make this solo. So here we go. That's without the delay. That's the one and only cameo by Humphrey Bogart.
Sit down. What the devil do you think you're doing? Start walking.
I don't even know what that's from. I think I found it. There's huge websites that are just loaded with movie dialogue samples of like 5 and 10 seconds each. And the files are named for what is said in the dialogue, not from what movie it comes from. And it's all indexed in searchables. This, I don't know what it came from, but I mean, you can just see this scene in your head when you hear this. What the devil do you think you're doing? He's, some British intelligence officer, in a bowler hat and a black raincoat and a white shirt and a tie and an umbrella, and he's outside and it's raining, and the guy next to him is like Mike Mazurki, and it's like this 5'5", brick of a guy, start walking. Also, get up, sit down, and the very last directive is start walking. As I say, this bit at the end here, this is my little homage to the Gang of Four. And I just took like bits and chunks and pieces of Robert's guitar fret, buzz, and noise, and sliced and diced and beat the living crap out of it, and that's what we got here. To me, that guitar solo, that's like the guitar equivalent of broken glass. That whole thing. It's just that's the image I have. I have the image of broken glass in some kind of machine is grinding it up into pulp. That's what that sounds like to me. Which I guess is I don't know, just it fits.
He looks pretty dead. He is.
There you have it, Washington, D.C.